Hello. So my name is Melanie Koslovic and I will be presenting on the deaf humor aspect of deaf culture today. I found this to be very interesting. We've discussed this slightly in American Sign Language. We've discussed this much more in our deaf culture class, but I learned a lot of things throughout this research that I hadn't known before. So my whole life I have been taught that I have 5 senses. It's a mainstream culture. My senses include sight, touch, taste, smell, and hear. Deaf people are perceived to be disabled and deprived of the world because they do not have this sense of hearing. Deaf people don't find this to be the same way. They don't find themselves to be deprived or disabled. They find themselves to be perfectly capable human beings. And in my opinion, some are even more capable than many of the hearing people that I know today. Deaf people do not agree with the mainstream culture's idea of the senses. They like to believe that they also have 5 senses, of which include sight, touch, taste, smell, and a sense of humor. Mark Twain once said this, "Tragedy and time create humor." Through the oppression of deaf people's language, culture, socialization, education, throughout all of time for hundreds of years, they've experienced much tragedy. We have to deal with tragedy in certain ways, and over hundreds of years and time, deaf people have developed a humor from the oppression that they've faced, and use a lot of the oppression in their humor as the source of the joke. This video here is just a video full of memes of babies. A meme is an internet joke, well, more or less it's a picture on the internet in which has typically a one-line joke on it. Babies are cute. I think almost everyone thinks that. And most memes are really funny, so I'm gonna share this video with you because I thought it was appropriate. Alright, so that video is about 3 minutes long. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but you get the idea. So before I discuss the specifics of deaf humor, I'd like to discuss what even is humor. It's not something that many of us think about in our day-to-day lives, but it's something that we all experience in our day-to-day lives. So this definition I have here in my slide is from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Humor is something that's amusing. It's a mental ideology of discussing, expressing, and appreciating things in which we find amusing. Humor is anything that's amusing, and it is one of the best ways that people can share their perceptions of the world, express themselves, and find intimacy and comfort within other people, and share how they feel. I know I personally am most strongly attracted to others who have very, very similar humors as I do, who like the same jokes no matter how lame they may be, in reference to my video who like the same memes. My friends and I send each other memes through the internet all the time. There are even websites dedicated to the sharing of humorous jokes and stories nowadays, blogs and whatnot. It's just a very easy way for people to connect with each other and share their ideas. So what makes deaf humor unique exactly? So in order to understand deaf humor, you need to first have a knowledge about the language in which it is being delivered in, which is American Sign Language here in America. You also have to have some kind of knowledge or experience of deaf culture itself. It's its whole own culture set within our American society and has lots of different values than hearing people do. Deaf humor's jokes are culturally based on their oppression and uses the deaf person deafness as their advantage. Their jokes typically poke fun at hearing people, and the deaf person usually comes out on top. There are 4 categories of deafness in which I'd like to discuss. The first being visual, the second, can't hear, third, linguistic, fourth, a response to oppression. First and foremost, visual deaf humor. Deaf people are people of the eyes. Most of their sensory perception of the world is through their eyes, through the signed languages in which they communicate in, through their perceptions of people's body language and actions. So, how are visual cues humorous exactly? Well, take a movie like King Kong. I've seen this movie so many times. My dad loves the classic, and I never thought about it like this until doing research for this report. So, not historically, deaf people, popularly, have watched King Kong without noise and see this massive monkey destructing a city and coming after hundreds of people who run and shriek and try to get away from him in a petrified manner and just make the goofiest of faces. Or, for example, a scene in a movie where someone is just sobbing their eyes out, sobbing. And I cannot even lie, people make ugly, funny faces when they cry. Sometimes it's hard for me not to laugh at people when they cry. I understand how insensitive that sounds, but sometimes it's just truly difficult, and that's a fact of life. One of the most historical markers of visual humor is silent cartoons. When I was a child, I loved Silent Mickey Mouse because it truly was so funny. Like, the actions and facial responses and attitudes portrayed are just so funny, and you can tell what's going on through your visual cues without even having to hear a punchline that lasts a whole 5 seconds. The second aspect of deaf humor is can't hear. So, to be deaf is not to just have the inability to hear. To be big D deaf, it is to have a home in a culture of your own. Deaf culture is universal within the world. Although they don't share the same lexical languages and experiences 100%, there's a shared sense of oppression and a shared sense of advantages and disadvantages of deafness. And, as I stated earlier, tragedy and time create humor. So, they find humor in the things in which they relate to. One of the most popular stories of can't hear jokes is a deaf couple stays at a motel. One of them forgets their cigarettes in their car. So, the husband returns to their car to retrieve them. Once leaving the car, he cannot remember which room is theirs. So, he blares on the horn of his car, and all the lights, except for one within the whole motel, flip on because all these hearing people are hearing this horn honking out of nowhere in the middle of the night. But he knows that his wife is in the room in which the lights didn't come on, and so he has used his and his wife's inability to hear to his advantage, and I just think that's really funny. As anyone would, deaf people don't like when jokes are made at their own expense. Such as Ray Holcomb wrote this whole book in which has many volumes called Hazards of Deafness. It portrays and makes jokes out of the quote-unquote torments of being deaf. One of the examples I found from this book was if you're vacuuming and trying to clean up a spot on the carpet, but it just won't clean up, and then you realize the vacuum isn't plugged in because the vacuum isn't plugged in, and you didn't know it wasn't operating because you couldn't hear it. This is just horribly unreasonable. A vacuum is a powerful piece of machinery which vibrates strongly when you're using it. Like, you would know if it was on or off in order to use it. The third category of deaf humor is linguistic. In America, people of deaf culture use American Sign Language. American Sign Language is a manual language, obviously, and cannot distinguish things such as phonemes like English-speaking people do. Phonemes are words in which sound the same but are spelled differently. ASL uses parameters such as hand shape, location, orientation, movement, and facial expression to portray a message or an emotion. For example, the sign for understand typically is a flicking up of the index finger near the temple. This signifies that you understand something. But if you use your pinky finger in the same manner, it signifies that your understanding is less than average. This personifies the ability to understand by giving it a magnitude. I'd like to refer to my graphic in which says, when deaf people fight, they let their fists do the talking. This isn't necessarily saying deaf people go in full-out combat to solve all of their issues, no. That's just saying they have a different modality of communication. As I say here in my slide, a deaf couple has an argument. The wife begins moving her hands in a larger path than she typically would sign at, and the husband signs at her, "Not need yell, I deaf, not blind." In American Sign Language, a larger movement signifies a stronger emotive response. So the wife signing at her husband in an argument is just her trying to show him that she's feeling something much stronger right now than normal, and that she's wanting to get a message across to him and let him know that she's feeling that. And as a response, possibly trying to be funny, he says, "Don't yell at me, I'm deaf, not blind, I can see what you're signing, you don't really need more space." And I just thought this was kind of funny. Like, I've learned about the space and movement of sign language and how it can affect the emotive interpretation of what you're saying, but this is just a funny joke to clarify it. The final category of deaf humor in which I'd like to discuss is a response to oppression. Tragedy and time create humor. Deaf people use their oppression to create humor. They use autist and oralist values to create humor. They outwit hearing people through their deafness. They always want to get the last laugh because hearing people are kind of stupid, quite honestly. So, an example of response to oppression are Zap stories. A Zap story in which I found is that a group of deaf people were at a restaurant eating dinner, signing to each other to communicate, just having a grand time, and then they witnessed this table of hearing people whispering and staring and pointing at them because they're signing, and that's not something that hearing people in today's society are used to seeing, unfortunately. And so, since they're sick of this happening to them, one of the deaf people approach a payphone in the restaurant nearby and start signing fervently into the input part of the telephone as if they were communicating through sign language through this phone in which is produced to be spoken into. The hearing people's jaws drop. They're all in amazement. Some of them even go check out the phone to see what's going on, as if it were a video phone that you could communicate through like that. And it's the deaf people won. A hearing person is not smart enough to realize that that phone actually does not operate that way. And if I were a part of that deaf group, I would be falling out of my chair laughing, because that's just ridiculous to me. In conclusion, there are many types of humor in general, but also many types of deaf humor. I've discussed 4 today. Humor is adapted and shared through experience. It's understood through experience. The deaf culture is universal. All kinds of deaf people from around the world share experiences and can share humor through that. They find humor in the same things. They've all experienced similar forms of oppression. It's a wonderful way to bring people together and share a social experience, a great way to make a friendship.